History remembers Sparta for its warriors. But what if their greatest weapon wasn't the sword? It was control. When a city fell, the men disappeared, and the women were absorbed into Sparta's design for domination. Names erased, families scattered, lives rewritten in the name of order. In Sparta, victory meant more than survival. It meant surrendering everything that made you human. That was the hidden cost of Spartan glory. If you value truth over legend, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. In the summer of 421 BCE, the city of Mantinea burned. Spartan soldiers marched through the ruins in silence. No looting, no shouting, only order. Among the ashes, the few survivors stood waiting for judgment. The men were shackled, the elders gathered aside, and the women, the young, the strong, the fertile, were separated, examined, and marked on wax tablets. The officers didn't ask names. They recorded ages, height, and health, like they were counting resources, not people. For Sparta, war was never chaos. It was a system. Every conquest was recorded, categorized, and absorbed. They didn't destroy cities to erase them. They destroyed them to rebuild them under Spartan rule. Killing warriors was easy. Controlling what came after, that was strategy. The chronicles tell us of heroes and victories, of the perfect discipline of Spartan soldiers. But behind every victory was a bureaucracy of domination. The men of Mantinea died quickly. The women faced something slower, assimilation. They were marched from the ruins of their homes under armed guard, not knowing where they were being taken, only that they were valuable to the state that had just killed their husbands. Sparta didn't conquer for gold or land alone. They conquered for people. The helots who worked the fields, the servants who filled their houses, the women who would sustain their population. All were parts of a living machine that kept Sparta's army alive. Every victory fed that machine. Every loss of another city meant an expansion of its labor and control. And in this system, survival became its own form of punishment. To live under Sparta meant to live without identity. The conquered were not citizens, not slaves, not even enemies. They were instruments, woven into the state's design for perfection. The story of Mantinea was not unique. It was a pattern that stretched across centuries, from Messenia to Arcadia, a blueprint of domination perfected through repetition. The Spartans didn't need to explain their cruelty. To them, it was efficiency. The law turned subjugation into order. The state turned lives into logistics. In the ruins of Mantinea, a new kind of warfare had taken shape, one that would outlast swords and shields. A war not of armies, but of systems. And the first victims of that system were not soldiers. They were the ones who survived them. To understand what happened to the women of Mantinea, you have to understand Sparta itself. It was not a city like Athens or Corinth. It was a military organism, engineered for one purpose: to win and to survive through control. Every law, every custom, every birth and death existed to serve that single idea. While other Greek cities built theatres, traded goods, and debated philosophy, Sparta built people. Boys were its raw material, molded from the age of 7 in a brutal training system called the agoge. They were taught to obey before they could read, to endure hunger, pain, and cold without complaint. At night, they slept on reeds. At dawn, they fought each other bare-handed. They were not allowed to cry. At 15, they learned that compassion was weakness. At 20, they learned that mercy was treason. A Spartan man's highest duty was to the state, not to family, not to love, not even to life. The result was an army that did not fear death because the individual no longer existed. There were no men in Sparta, only parts of the machine. But every machine needs fuel, and the fuel of Sparta was human labor, the helots. These were not foreign slaves bought in markets. They were conquered Greeks, captured during centuries of war, primarily from Messinian. Entire populations turned into hereditary servants who worked the land, harvested crops, and provided everything the Spartan warriors needed to live. For every Spartan citizen, there were 10 helots working unseen in the fields. The Spartans did not consider them human equals. They were the soil that feeds us, as one ancient writer recorded. Helots could be beaten, killed, or taken at will without punishment. They were property of the state, not individuals, not families, not even names. This system made Sparta powerful, but also fragile. The Helots vastly outnumbered their masters. A single coordinated uprising could destroy the city. So Sparta lived in constant paranoia. Every law, every ritual, every battle was shaped by one silent fear, that the enslaved might one day rise. This fear created a society obsessed with control, not just over enemies, but over its own citizens. Spartan men were forbidden from trade, wealth, or art. They owned nothing but their weapons. The state provided their food, their homes, even their marriages. The goal was to eliminate desire, because desire created disobedience. Even love was regulated. Spartan men lived in barracks until age 30, sleeping among their comrades, trained to think collectively. Women, meanwhile, were told their duty was not beauty or gentleness, but strength. They exercised, trained, and shouted war songs, because the state believed strong women bore strong sons. And when the wars came, as they always did, those sons would die young. Sparta had to replace them, constantly, efficiently. That was where the women of conquered cities came in. For Sparta, women were a resource, not a gender. They could be citizens, mothers, servants, or replacements, depending on where they were born. When Mantinea fell, the system absorbed its survivors with the same cold precision that trained its warriors. Some women would become helots, tied to the land forever, their children born into servitude. Others, especially the young or noble-born, were taken into the state's custody, to be assigned. It was not random. Spartan commanders recorded who was widowed, who was healthy, who could bear children. It was data. Ancient population management disguised as ritual. Sparta's strength depended on maintaining a perfect balance. Enough citizens to fight, enough helots to sustain them, and no trace of rebellion among the conquered. Every human body, free or enslaved, had to fit somewhere in that equation. That's why the capture of Mantinea was not a massacre. It was administration. The men were removed from the ledger. The women were reassigned within it. For the state, conquest was not about destruction. It was about redistribution. When you study the Spartan system, you realize it was not born from savagery, but from fear. the fear of losing control. The same fear that made them the most disciplined soldiers in Greece also made them architects of systemic cruelty. They believed domination preserved order, and order preserved survival. But survival for whom? Not for the helots who labored in silence, nor for the women whose names were erased from history. It was survival for the idea of Sparta, an idea that could not exist without breaking everything around it. Every boy trained in the agoge was told, "Your life belongs to the state." Every captured woman was told the same, but in a different language, through silence, obedience, and loss. Both were enslaved by the same ideal, one in uniform, the other without a name. This is what made Sparta unique. It did not rely on chaos or emotion. It industrialized domination long before the word existed. It turned hierarchy into law, fear into ritual, and subjugation into duty. The city was small, but its control stretched over tens of thousands of lives. When ancient historians like Plutarch and Xenophon praised Spartan discipline, they were describing a system that could regulate even cruelty. The city did not burn villages out of hatred. It absorbed them out of necessity. The women of Mantinea were not victims of passion. They were victims of policy. And yet, within this machine, a contradiction lived. The same state that demanded absolute obedience from its citizens also depended on those it enslaved. The helots worked the fields so Spartans could fight. The captured women ensured there would always be more Spartans to replace the dead. Sparta's glory stood on foundations of quiet suffering. But silence does not last forever. Archaeology, fragments of law, and scattered testimonies reveal that beneath Sparta's perfection was a constant hum of revolt, despair, and resistance. Stories the chroniclers refused to tell. For now, the machine of control still functioned flawlessly. The women of Mantinea had vanished into it. The fields of Laconia were full, the barracks echoed with drills, and the next generation of soldiers was already being shaped. But every system built on fear eventually faces the same question. How long can a state survive when every human within it, soldier, slave, and captive, exists only to serve its hunger for control? In Sparta, victory didn't end with the fall of a city. It began there. The moment the gates were broken and the enemy silenced, a second war started, the war for control of the survivors. And in that war, women became the center of strategy. To the Spartans, killing the men ended a generation. Controlling the women ended a civilization. Every conquest had to be permanent, not just in land, but in lineage. The body of the defeated became part of the Spartan system, a living border that no longer needed walls. After Mantinea, ancient sources describe a grim order. The city's men were executed or enslaved, but the women were gathered, assessed, and divided according to state needs. Commanders inspected their age, health, and background. Widows were especially valuable. They had proven fertility and no living husbands, the perfect subjects for assimilation. There was no chaos, no random cruelty. What Sparta did was deliberate. The army didn't rape or plunder, it reassigned. The act of domination wasn't an impulse, it was administration. In the same way a general organized troops, Sparta organized human lives. Some of the Mantinean women were sent to rural estates, absorbed into the helot class, permanent laborers owned not by individuals, but by the state. They would work Spartan lands and raise children who would never be free. These women became invisible, their language fading over generations until only fragments survived in lullabies whispered in secret. Others, especially those of noble birth, faced something colder: state integration. They were brought into Sparta itself, housed temporarily under supervision, and then assigned to Spartan citizens. Ancient chroniclers like Plutarch mention that this process was framed as necessity, a civic duty, a way to strengthen the population after years of constant war. But behind the language of duty was a clear political function: absorption through domestic life. To erase an enemy, Sparta didn't need to erase their memory. It only needed to make their descendants Spartan. The women of conquered cities were instruments of that erasure, compelled to raise children who would serve the state that had destroyed their homes. For a society that worshipped purity, this seems contradictory. But Sparta's version of purity wasn't moral, it was logistical. A system in perfect balance could incorporate anything, as long as it obeyed. The conquest of women wasn't lust, it was mathematics. The Spartan leadership calculated everything: how many warriors had fallen, how many children were needed to replace them, how many captives could bear those replacements. Records from later writers hint that Sparta even regulated childbirth, assigning women to citizens who lacked heirs or whose wives had died. Marriage became a civic mechanism, not a personal choice. To the outside world, Sparta appeared disciplined and divine, a city that stood above the chaos of Greece. But inside its walls, that discipline had a price measured in silence. The women who entered its system ceased to exist as individuals. Their original names vanished from the records. They became wives, servants, caretakers, titles without identity. And yet, within that silence, traces of defiance endured. Archaeological evidence from the Spartan region shows small amulets and household idols from non-Spartan origins, symbols the conquered women must have kept hidden. Tiny acts of memory, carved from clay, surviving in the cracks of empire. They could not fight openly, but they could remember. And remembering was its own rebellion. Still, the Spartan system was relentless. Every aspect of life reinforced its logic. Men were raised to die without fear. Women were raised to serve without choice. The conquered were reshaped until they could no longer tell where their old life ended and the new one began. From a distance, it looked like order. Up close, it was a society built on erased faces. This is what made Sparta terrifying to its rivals. It didn't just defeat cities, it consumed them. Its wars did not end with treaties or truces. They ended with transformation. Every enemy became part of the system, willingly or not. To the Spartans, this was success. To history, it was a quiet annihilation. The case of Mantinea was only one of many. Over centuries, the same pattern repeated: capture, classify, convert. Messenia, Arcadia, Elis, all absorbed in cycles of control. Their women became the carriers of a new order, their sons the next generation of Spartan strength. The brilliance of this strategy lay in its invisibility. No one wrote songs about the conquered women. No monuments were built for them. Their suffering was bureaucratic, efficient, silent, and permanent. But behind that silence lies the deeper truth. Sparta's power wasn't born on the battlefield. It was born in its capacity to turn people into systems. Every rule, every ritual, every victory rested on the transformation of human lives into data for survival. The empire that called itself pure was, in truth, built from the fragments of the conquered. And the longer it perfected that control, the more it lost the one thing it claimed to defend, its own humanity. Because what happens to a society that controls everything except compassion? When Sparta conquered, they didn't just claim the land, they restructured it. Every conquest was an act of engineering, and at its center was a ritual that looked, from the outside, like marriage. But this was no union of love. It was the state's way of turning subjugation into ceremony. Ancient sources like Plutarch and Xenophon describe these so-called marriages between Spartan citizens and women taken from defeated cities. They were not spontaneous acts of cruelty. They were policy. Each union was decided by Spartan authorities, who treated it as a civic assignment. The bride's consent did not matter. The husband's feelings did not matter. What mattered was that Sparta maintained its numbers and its purity of discipline. The city was obsessed with balance, between strength and fear, between control and chaos. It needed new citizens to replace those lost in battle. But its population was too small, its wars too frequent. The answer was found in assimilation by ritual. When a new group of captive women arrived, officials selected those of noble birth or proven fertility. They were prepared like brides, dressed in fine garments, and brought before the Spartan assembly. There, in public view, they were formally given to citizens, often to men who had lost wives or who had not yet produced heirs. What followed resembled a wedding, but felt more like a performance. The ceremony imitated Greek tradition, the veil, the vows, the offerings to the gods. But everyone in attendance knew the truth. It was a display of victory disguised as sanctity. To the state, this ritual achieved three things. First, it humiliated the defeated elite. To see their wives and daughters publicly handed over to Spartan citizens was to witness their lineage turned into property. Second, it replenished the Spartan population with children who would be raised not as foreigners, but as Spartans, erasing the cultural memory of the conquered. And third, it reminded every citizen watching that the state could decide even the most private matters of life. Imagine the silence inside those halls, the flickering torches, the crowd murmuring approval, and the women standing motionless, speaking the ritual words through tears. The law called it a blessing, but for the women, it was the burial of everything they had been. From that moment on, they belonged to Sparta. They would live in their husbands' homes, run their households, and bear children who would one day fight for the army that had destroyed their fathers. It was the ultimate paradox, to be both a wife and a trophy, both protected and imprisoned. Spartan society framed this as justice. To them, order was sacred. If the gods had given Sparta victory, then the conquered must serve the divine plan. The ritual of forced marriage wasn't an act of cruelty, it was an offering. The woman became the sacrifice that kept the system balanced. And yet, fragments of poetry and local legend suggest that some of these women refused to vanish quietly. In border villages, there are records of female cults. secret gatherings where women sang hymns in dialects no longer spoken, mourning the cities that no longer existed. Archaeologists have uncovered votive figurines of unknown goddesses buried beneath Spartan homes, proof that the conquered carried their faith in silence, hidden beneath the flaws of their new masters. But defiance had limits. The law in Sparta was absolute. The philosopher Lycurgus, who shaped much of Spartan tradition, had declared that the state must be stronger than blood, stronger than love. What was private had to serve the collective. What was human had to be controlled. For the women forced into these unions, there was no path back to freedom, only adaptation. Over time, some of them bore children, and those children became indistinguishable from their Spartan peers. The policy worked. The conquest was completed not through violence, but through inheritance. Plutarch would later praise Sparta's stability, its unity, its discipline. He called it a society without corruption. But behind that praise lay a truth too dark to admire. Sparta was unified because it had erased every difference, every dissent, every voice that might say no. The forced marriages were not isolated tragedies. They were the foundation of the system. Each one turned an enemy's lineage into a tool. Each ceremony reaffirmed the same message. Sparta owned life itself. The city had found a way to convert human pain into political order. It didn't need whips or prisons. It had ritual. It had law. And through those, it could transform conquest into continuity. But this perfection carried a hidden fault. A society that turns obedience into worship can survive, until its people forget what freedom even means. And when that day comes, the state no longer needs to enslave others. It enslaves itself. Sparta called it the preservation of strength. History would call it something else. State breeding. It was not a rumor or moral panic. It was policy, written into the fabric of the Spartan system. Every birth, every pairing, every household existed for one purpose: to serve the needs of the state. To the Spartans, war was eternal, and so was the need to replace the dead. A perfect warrior society could not rely on chance. It had to design its future citizens. And so, after generations of conquest, Sparta began using its captives not just as labor, but as living material for population control. In official language, these practices were described as assignments for lineage. The reality was far colder. Women from conquered cities, often selected for beauty, strength, or intelligence, were given roles that combined service, motherhood, and surveillance. Some were placed with Spartan citizens under the banner of civic marriage. Others were paired strategically with non-citizens or even helots, depending on what kind of offspring the state required. It was an early form of eugenic planning. Sparta didn't use the word breeding, but the logic was unmistakable. Match the strong with the strong. Eliminate the weak. A law attributed to Lycurgus stated that no child unfit for war shall be raised. That law applied not only to Spartan citizens, but also, unofficially, to the people they ruled. The state decided who should conceive and who should disappear. This system blurred the line between conqueror and conquered. Children born from these unions were carefully categorized. If the father was a Spartan citizen, the child could become a Mothax, half citizen, half helot, eligible for military training, though never equal. If the father was helot, or a foreigner, the child was automatically enslaved, becoming part of the permanent labor force. It was a social pyramid built on bloodlines, one designed to keep power in the hands of a few while making sure everyone below existed to sustain them. For the women trapped in this structure, life became a contradiction. They were valued, but not respected, needed, but never free. The Spartan system measured them by their utility to the state, not their humanity. They lived under constant observation. Temple inscriptions refer to households under state supervision, implying that certain women were monitored for fertility and output. Even their children were counted in military registries, long before they could walk. Birth was no longer a private act, it was a civic function. And through this system, Sparta achieved what no other Greek city had: demographic control through ideology. Other cities fought wars for territory. Sparta fought wars for continuity. The men who trained in the agoge were taught that their strength came from divine order, that the gods themselves demanded discipline. The women who labored under this reproductive order were told the same thing, that their suffering served a higher balance. Religion sanctified control. Ritual justified efficiency. It's easy to mistake this for barbarism, but to Sparta, it was mathematics. They saw the human population as a field, one that had to be cultivated, pruned, and corrected. Every person had a function, every function a limit. Even love was bureaucratized. When Plutarch described the Spartan marriage laws, he noted that older men were encouraged, even required, to share their wives with younger warriors if it was believed that union would produce stronger children. To them, this wasn't betrayal, it was civic duty. What mattered wasn't loyalty between husband and wife, but loyalty to the state's design. Now imagine what that logic meant for the conquered. If even Spartan citizens were treated as components, what chance did the enslaved have? Women taken from Mantinea, Messinian, or Elis became the unseen architects of Sparta's future, not by choice, but by order. Some would bear sons trained to kill. Others would bear daughters raised to serve the households of those killers. Each generation was bound tighter into the system, erasing where one people ended and another began. And yet, despite the ruthlessness of the plan, it worked. For centuries, Sparta maintained one of the most stable population ratios in the ancient world: small, disciplined, and self-replenishing. Every conquest fed the next. Every defeat was compensated by assimilation. The city survived longer than its cruelty should have allowed. But beneath the surface, something's changing. Archaeological evidence shows shifts in burial customs during this period. More unmarked graves, more anonymous burials of women and children in Spartan territory. The dead were no longer honored as individuals. They had become statistics. This was the final victory of control, when even death lost its meaning. By the 5th century BCE, Spartan society was a perfect paradox, a city obsessed with strength, but dependent on subjugation, a people who worshipped freedom, yet lived entirely under discipline. The system that had made them invincible was also stripping away what made them human. Every law written to preserve Sparta's power became a mirror, reflecting its decay. The state could design children, regulate marriages, and control every breath, but it could not command loyalty forever. Because the one thing Sparta never understood was that control breeds resistance. And the more perfect the system became, the more inevitable its cracks would grow. The world would soon discover that even a society built on obedience can collapse, not from invasion, but from within. Every empire needs a foundation. Rome had its roads, Egypt had its grain, Sparta had its helots. They were not slaves in the private sense, nor citizens with rights. They were the living machinery of the state, the invisible infrastructure that made every Spartan victory possible. Helots farmed the land, forged the tools, cooked the meals, and raised the children of soldiers who were too busy training to live ordinary lives. Without them, the Spartan miracle of discipline would have collapsed in a week. And yet, the helots were never acknowledged. They were a shadow population, 10 for every Spartan, a majority that could never speak. Most of them were descendants of conquered Messenians, Arcadians, and other Greek peoples whose cities had once stood proudly before the Spartan spears came. They remembered freedom. That memory made them dangerous. To control them, Sparta built one of the most sophisticated systems of psychological domination the ancient world ever saw. It combined terror with ritual, humiliation with law. Every autumn, before the harvest, the Spartan ephors, the city's high officials, would declare war on the helots. Not metaphorically, but legally. This annual declaration allowed any Spartan citizen to kill a helot without consequence. It turned murder into a civic privilege. Then came the crypteia, the secret hunt. Young Spartan men, recently graduated from the agoge, were sent into the countryside with daggers and orders. Kill any helot who looked too strong, too confident, too intelligent. It was both a rite of passage and a purge. The message was clear. Strength outside the system was treason. For helot women, life was double servitude. They worked in the fields under the sun, carrying loads heavier than their bodies. And at night, they labored in Spartan households, cooking, weaving, cleaning, nursing. Some became wet nurses for Spartan infants, feeding the children of their masters while their own went hungry. They were essential, but disposable. A helot woman could be beaten, violated, or killed without any penalty. The law did not see her as a person. She was a function. And yet, these women sustained the empire that erased them. They raised the warriors who would grow up to hunt their own kind. They kept the homes of those who despised them clean. They bore the silence that allowed Sparta's discipline to appear unbreakable. What made the system so terrifying wasn't its cruelty. It was its efficiency. Sparta had no overseers with whips, no chains across the fields. They didn't need them. They ruled through fear internalized so deeply that the helots policed themselves. The message was always the same. You can die at any moment, for any reason, or for no reason at all. That uncertainty became a weapon sharper than any blade. Still, rebellion simmered. Archaeological traces and later accounts speak of whispered uprisings, torches seen in the night, scattered villages burned by the Spartans in unexplained accidents. Each revolt was crushed swiftly, brutally, with entire communities exterminated to make an example. The helots became the perfect paradox, a people too necessary to destroy and too dangerous to set free. Their labor was the backbone of Sparta's wealth. Their subjugation was its greatest vulnerability. The entire state balanced on the backs of those it despised most. Economically, this system was genius. A permanent labor force, inherited by generation, producing everything while citizens trained for war. The Spartan soldier was the freest man in Greece. precisely because someone else paid the cost of his freedom. But psychologically, it was poison. Every Spartan child grew up knowing that his comfort depended on terror. Every Spartan woman knew her authority over Helot servants came from fear, not respect. And every Helot child learned that strength was a death sentence. In this atmosphere, paranoia became policy. The fear of uprising shaped every decision Sparta made. They couldn't travel too far, couldn't garrison too many soldiers abroad, couldn't even leave their homeland unguarded. Behind every victory lay the constant dread that one day the Helots might rise. And if they did, there would be no Sparta left to suppress them. For the women of conquered cities like Mantinea, being turned into Helots was both a sentence and an inheritance. Their children were born into chains before they could walk. Their daughters would grow up to serve the same masters, and their sons would labor the same fields until their bodies broke. And yet, within this endless cycle, tiny acts of defiance survived. A stolen loaf of bread, a whispered song in an outlawed dialect, a story told at night about the time before conquest. These were rebellions of memory. They could not win the war, but they could keep a people from disappearing entirely. Even Plutarch, writing centuries later, admitted that the Helots were the greatest threat to Spartan stability. But he did not say the obvious, that the Helots were also the greatest proof of Spartan hypocrisy, because the city that worshipped freedom had built its glory on slavery. The society that claimed to breed strength had institutionalized fear, and the longer the system endured, the more fragile it became. For every Spartan soldier born, there were 10 Helot laborers who quietly kept count, waiting for the moment when the balance of terror might tip. When that moment finally came, it would not arrive with armies or banners. It would come with silence, the same silence Sparta had taught them so well. Every empire celebrates victory, but Sparta turned it into theater. When their armies returned home, they didn't just bring spoils. They brought proof, living reminders of what defying Sparta meant. And that proof came in the form of women. After each major campaign, the city held what it called triumph ceremonies. To outsiders, they looked like parades of glory. But for the conquered, they were spectacles of degradation, carefully staged to remind everyone of Sparta's absolute control. Captured women from enemy cities, nobles, priestesses, wives of generals, were marched through the streets, stripped of their former symbols of status. Their fine clothes were replaced with rough linen. Their hair was cut short. They were displayed before the Spartan people, walking silently while soldiers announced the names of the cities they came from, names that would soon disappear from maps. This was not chaos or cruelty for pleasure. It was ritualized dominance. Each parade followed a strict order. The Spartan king or general rode at the front, representing divine order. Behind him, the Spartan women, wives and mothers of warriors, lined the streets, jeering at the captives. Their mockery had purpose. It transformed the humiliation of others into a civic celebration of superiority. Spartan women, unlike most in Greece, enjoyed real power at home. They could own property, command servants, and even criticize men in public. But this freedom came at a moral cost. It was built on comparison. To remain free, they had to witness others enslaved. To feel noble, they had to see others shamed. Plutarch records an unsettling moment. After one conquest, a Spartan woman reportedly pointed at a line of captives and told her daughter, These are what happens when women raise cowards. It was both lesson and warning. In Sparta, femininity itself was politicized, used as proof of victory. The process was simple: turn the conquered into mirrors of inferiority, make their suffering visible, their silence memorable. The message spread faster than any army: resist Sparta, and your wives will walk the same road. Ancient writers noted that these parades often coincided with festivals to Artemis Orthia, goddess of discipline and submission. Captives were forced to stand before the altar while Spartan children looked on. It was education by humiliation. The young learned early that domination was divine and pity was weakness. Even the architecture reinforced the lesson. In the main square of Sparta stood the choros, a circular platform where dancers performed songs of victory while captives were made to watch. The women of the defeated cities stood on the lower steps while Spartan maidens danced above them, literal embodiment of hierarchy. Imagine the sight: torches flickering, drums echoing, and the conquered standing still, faces lit by firelight, as the crowd chanted, "Sparta endures." No one screamed, no one spoke. That silence, orchestrated, public, absolute, was the perfection of control. But why parade women, not men? Because in ancient Greece, the humiliation of women was the humiliation of their men. In Sparta's political logic, to conquer the body of the enemy's city, you had to conquer the bodies that bore its citizens. Women symbolized continuity, the defeated city's future. Breaking them publicly meant breaking its memory. Over time, these rituals became institutional. The spoils of war were divided: livestock, metals, and people. The men went to the mines or the fields, the women to the parades, temples, and households. The line between slave, servant, and symbol blurred completely. Even as other Greek cities condemned these spectacles, they could not ignore their effect. Sparta's reputation grew into myth. It didn't need to conquer every city to rule Greece. Fear did the work. The humiliation parades also functioned internally. They reminded Spartans of what awaited them if they ever failed. To disobey was to fall to the level of the captives they mocked. Thus, public cruelty became social glue, the ritual that bound a city together through shared dominance. To the outside world, it was ceremony. To the women forced to walk in silence, it was erasure. The moment they ceased to exist as individuals and became instruments of warning. Some accounts suggest that in later centuries, the rituals grew crueler. Captive women were forced to sing songs of praise to Sparta, their voices trembling as soldiers watched. Others were made to carry symbols of their lost cities: broken shields, burned statues, while Spartan children threw grain at them like offerings to the gods. And yet, in the ruins where those parades once took place, archaeologists have found small offerings buried in the ground: miniature jars, carved figurines, fragments of charms, evidence that the captives, even under the eyes of their captors, still prayed. Not for rescue, but for remembrance. It is one of history's cruelest ironies that these women, humiliated to erase their cities, are now the reason we remember them. The conquerors built monuments to themselves. The conquered left behind whispers in the soil. Sparta believed control could make suffering disappear. But the record, written in dust, bone, and pottery, proves the opposite. Every act of domination leaves a trace. Every ritual of silence plants a seed of memory. And long after Sparta's walls fell, the ground still remembers what they tried to bury. No empire believes itself evil. Even Sparta, a state built on conquest and silence, thought it was righteous. To justify domination, they invoked what every civilization turns to when morality breaks: the gods. Sparta's religion wasn't the gentle mysticism of Athens or the philosophical balance of Delphi. It was a theology of hierarchy, a divine order where strength equaled virtue and submission was sacred. Every act of conquest, every chain forged, every command obeyed, all were offerings to that cosmic order. The Spartans believed they descended from Heracles, son of Zeus, a lineage of divine conquerors. To them, rule over weaker peoples wasn't oppression, it was destiny. Their victories weren't the result of luck or brutality, but divine approval. To resist Sparta was to resist the gods. This belief gave structure to their cruelty. When they destroyed a city, it wasn't murder, it was purification. When they enslaved the Helots, it wasn't exploitation, it was correction. The same rituals that sanctified birth and war sanctified domination. Religious justification seeped into every corner of life. Before a campaign, priests read omens, not to ask if conquest was right, but how the gods wished it to be carried out. Every law from Lycurgus, the semi-mythical founder of Sparta's constitution, was treated as divine revelation. His reforms didn't just regulate the army, they turned discipline into faith. Under Lycurgus's great retra, personal freedom ceased to exist. The state became the temple, and obedience the prayer. Children were not raised by families, but by the community, stripped of private love so they could learn to worship the collective. Pain was sacred, fear was cleansing, and mercy, weakness. The women of conquered lands were drawn into this system through ritual. Many were assigned to temple labor, serving Artemis Orthia or Athena Chalkioikos. To outsiders, this seemed like protection, a life in service of gods instead of masters. But the temples were just another form of control. These women lived under vows they never chose, their labor and purity dedicated to the same gods who sanctioned their captivity. The irony was sharp. The goddess Artemis, worshipped as protector of women and childbirth, presided over ceremonies that turned conquered mothers into servants of the state that had destroyed their families. Some inscriptions from Laconia reveal the contradiction openly. Dedications written by Spartan officials thanking the gods for submitting the fertile lands and the fruitful wombs of our enemies to our order. Religion had become economics wrapped in prayer. Even cruelty had procedure. The Crypteia, that secret night hunt against Helots, was introduced to Spartan youth as a religious test, a rite demanded by Apollo to cleanse the land of impurity. The act of killing was no longer violence, it was purification. The gods, conveniently, always agreed with the law. Sparta's priests didn't offer forgiveness, they offered structure. When a city was conquered, a formal sacrifice was made, a bull for victory, and sometimes, though rarely recorded, human captives for fear. The ritual logic was perfect. Spill blood to preserve order. And yet, in surviving fragments of Spartan law tablets, there's an eerie precision. The codes define punishment for disobedience down to the smallest detail. A soldier who hesitated could lose citizenship. A mother who mourned too loudly during wartime funerals could be fined for undisciplined grief. Even sorrow was regulated. This was how the system endured, by moralizing efficiency. Every act of cruelty was recast as duty, every injustice as virtue. To question the law was to question the gods. And no one in Sparta, not soldier, not woman, not slave, could afford to do that. The religious justification extended beyond the city. Spartan ambassadors told other Greek states that their dominance kept the world in balance, that the gods favored a stable hierarchy over chaotic freedom. Even philosophers like Xenophon, who admired Spartan order, avoided condemning its brutality. To outsiders, it was hard, but necessary. But the truth was darker. The gods of Sparta were never divine beings. They were reflections of fear, discipline, and obedience. A theology of control disguised as destiny. In this world, suffering wasn't tragedy, it was law. The cries of the conquered echoed in the temples that claimed to sanctify them. And through it all, the system remained perfect, unbroken, almost beautiful in its horror, until the world around it began to change. Other Greek cities were evolving, Athens with philosophy, Thebes with revolution, Macedon with ambition. Sparta stayed still, frozen in its divine perfection. Because when your gods demand obedience above all, even survival becomes secondary. The empire that called its cruelty sacred would soon learn what happens when faith turns into a cage, and the gods you built stop answering. Every empire built on fear imagines it can outlive the sound of rebellion. But silence doesn't last forever. It listens, gathers, and eventually speaks back. By the 5th century BCE, the perfection of Spartan order began to rot from within. The helots, once voiceless, had learned patience. Their children had learned coordination. And then came an event the Spartans could neither predict nor command: an earthquake. Around 464 BCE, the ground under Laconia shook with a force that flattened villages and cracked the walls of Sparta itself. Temples collapsed. Training grounds split open. Hundreds of young warriors were crushed beneath the ruins. The same city that had believed itself unbreakable found itself begging for help. But the Helots saw something else: opportunity. For generations, they had been taught to bow, to obey, to fear. Now the gods themselves seemed to strike against Sparta. When the tremors ended, the Helots of Messenia rose. They burned Spartan farms, ambushed patrols, and seized Mount Ithome, a natural fortress their ancestors had once called home. For the first time in centuries, Sparta was forced onto the defensive. The earthquake had revealed what the Spartans refused to see. Their power was an illusion balanced on terror. When terror faltered, so did the state. The war that followed, known to historians as the Third Messinian Revolt, lasted nearly a decade. It was not a rebellion of barbarians, but a calculated campaign of endurance. Sparta, unable to suppress it alone, had to ask its old rival Athens for aid, a humiliation that shook its national pride to the core. Athenian troops arrived, trained in siege warfare. But when they saw the devastation, the silent hatred on the faces of the Helots, the paranoia of their Spartan hosts, they realized this was not a rebellion. It was a reckoning. Athens withdrew its forces in disgust. Sparta never forgave them. The alliance shattered. In that moment, the seeds of the Peloponnesian War were planted, a conflict that would consume Greece and expose the rot within its mightiest warrior state. The Helot revolt was eventually crushed, yes. Mount Ithome fell. The rebels were relocated, resettled, erased. But something irreversible had changed. For the first time, Sparta had been afraid, not of invasion, but of its own foundation. Inside the city, suspicion grew like mold. Every whisper could be rebellion, every servant a spy. The crypteia intensified. Surveillance spread from fields to homes. Even Spartan women, once symbols of discipline, were accused of softness, indulgence, betrayal. The ruling class tightened control, forbidding citizens from travel, trade, or dialogue with foreigners. Isolation became ideology, but isolation breeds stagnation, and stagnation is slow death. The same laws that had once made Sparta strong now suffocated it. Young men continued to die in endless wars. The citizen population dwindled. By the 4th century BCE, there were fewer than 2,000 full Spartan citizens left, an empire reduced to a caste. To preserve numbers, the state turned again to forced unions, assigning Helot women to Spartan men to produce replacement citizens. But the illusion of purity had already broken. The bloodlines they once guarded so fiercely became blurred beyond recognition. The ideology of control had devoured itself. Economically, Sparta collapsed. Without trade or art, its wealth existed only through conquest, and conquest required soldiers they no longer had. Philosophically, it decayed. Other cities began to question the old myths. Was Sparta truly virtuous or merely efficient at cruelty? Even the gods fell silent. The temples of Artemis and Apollo grew empty. The rituals that once united the city became hollow performances. The prayers continued, but belief was gone. And yet, the irony is haunting. For centuries, Sparta had feared rebellion more than anything. When it finally came, it didn't look like fire or murder. It looked like indifference. The Helots stopped resisting, not because they were defeated, but because they understood the truth. Their masters had become prisoners too, trapped in laws they could no longer live without. By the time Macedon rose under Philip II and later Alexander, Sparta was a relic. The city still called itself free, but it no longer ruled anything beyond its borders. Its discipline had turned into nostalgia, its silence into emptiness. A few generations later, when the Romans arrived, they found Sparta intact, its walls standing, its people polite, but its soul hollow. A local Roman chronicler wrote, "They still speak of Lycurgus, but they no longer remember why they obey him." It was the final humiliation. The empire that had enslaved others through obedience had died of its own obedience. History often romanticizes Sparta as the model of order, the warrior utopia. But the truth is darker. It was a laboratory of control that finally suffocated its creators. Its downfall was not defeat in battle, but victory taken too far. A civilization that perfected domination until it could no longer remember how to be free. And the women it silenced, the captives, the laborers, the forgotten, outlived it in memory. Their nameless prayers, carved into shards of clay and hidden under temple stones, are now the only voices left. Because when the system collapses, it is never the conqueror who speaks last. It is the conquered, whispering through history, "We endured you." When Sparta finally died, it did not die screaming. It died quietly, in the way all systems of control do, by becoming a story. Centuries later, when travelers and philosophers came to see the ruins of Sparta, they found no empire, no armies, no slaves, just fragments of marble, silent fields, and villagers who barely remembered the laws that had once ruled half the Aegean. But memory is selective. The world didn't remember the fear, the cruelty, the broken lives. It remembered discipline. It remembered glory. It remembered the legend, not the cost. The Sparta that history teaches us today is not the Sparta that existed. It's the Sparta invented by those who needed a model for obedience: kings, generals, revolutionaries. They took a society of control and turned it into a virtue. The Romans idolized them first. They admired the discipline, the austerity, the ability to command through fear. The philosopher Plutarch wrote romantic biographies of Spartan heroes, stories that erased the helots and glorified the kings. In his version, Spartan cruelty became lawfulness. Spartan silence became wisdom. He turned a state that had institutionalized human suffering into a fable about civic strength. Later, during the Enlightenment, European monarchs revived the myth again. In the 18th century, Prussia, the militarized kingdom that would one day form the heart of the German Empire, modeled its schools and army discipline after Spartan virtue. Children were drilled, citizens were monitored, and obedience was recast as patriotism. Voltaire called it the noblest government ever imagined. He never mentioned the helots. Even the French Revolution, which claimed to liberate man from tyranny, invoked Sparta as an example of pure republican virtue. They forgot that in Sparta, the republic existed only for the rulers, and everyone else lived in chains. And in the modern age, the myth grew darker. Fascist ideologues in the 20th century praised Sparta for its racial purity and eugenic discipline. Adolf Hitler himself cited Sparta as the first state to practice selective breeding. To him, it wasn't horror, it was precedent. The lie had come full circle. A society that had destroyed itself by trying to perfect control had become the model for those who sought to perfect it again. But myths are never harmless. They shape the way civilizations think about power, about who deserves freedom and who deserves obedience. The myth of Sparta tells us that control is noble, that fear builds strength, that the state must be worshipped like a god. That myth still lives, in classrooms that glorify discipline over compassion, in governments that speak of stability while crushing dissent, in cultures that mistake silence for peace. The real Sparta, the one buried beneath centuries of propaganda, tells a different story. It warns that efficiency without empathy is a kind of rot, one that eats through law, religion, and pride until nothing human remains. Its perfection was not strength, but fragility disguised as order. When archaeologists unearthed Spartan graves, they found no grand monuments, no golden tombs, just simple stones and mass burials. A city that had worshipped victory left behind no face, no names, no joy. Its only legacy was the system itself, and even that, in time, turned to dust. Meanwhile, the voices Sparta silenced, the helot songs, the Mantinean prayers, the women who whispered lullabies to children born in captivity, survived in fragments of pottery, in footnotes of foreign writers, in the soil. It is through them not the conquerors, that the truth endures. Because in the end, the myth of Sparta isn't about Sparta at all. It's about us and the stories we choose to keep. Every time we admire power without asking what it costs, every time we call obedience a virtue, every time we romanticize domination and call it order, we resurrect Sparta. The ruins stand as a warning. A civilization that worships control will always mistake silence for peace, until the silence becomes permanent. That is Sparta's true afterlife, not in glory, but in memory. A ghostly city that still whispers to every empire that follows, "You may command the world, but you will never command the human heart." When we speak of Sparta, we speak of warriors, kings, and laws, but never of the women who carried the weight of its empire. They were the foundation that the myth erased, the silent architecture beneath centuries of obedience. The chronicles call them wives of the defeated, captives of war, helot, mothers. But archaeology tells us something more haunting. They weren't background figures. They were the living engines of Sparta's survival. From Mantinea to Messenia, from Argos to Arcadia, women bore the scars of conquest that Sparta built into its identity. They worked its fields, raised its next generation, and endured its rituals. And yet, no name survived. When archaeologists unearthed Spartan farmsteads, they found hundreds of clay tablets marked not with names, but inventory numbers. Female, age 25. Good breeder. Skilled in weaving. Childbearing capacity, 2. The handwriting was administrative, cold, exact, and legal. Each woman was a statistic in a military economy that disguised exploitation as stability. For centuries, historians wrote about Spartan men training for war, dying for glory. But the truth is, the real soldiers of Spartan endurance were women who had no choice in the matter. Every field they ploughed, every child they birthed, every meal they prepared under the watch of their masters was a continuation of conquest by other means. They became instruments of assimilation, forced to raise children who would fight for the empire that destroyed their homes. Imagine that contradiction. A mother teaching her son to honor the sword that killed his father. Some of these women lived long enough to see their sons return in armor, strangers carrying the same crest that marked their own enslavement. That is the deepest cruelty of the Spartan system. It made its victims complicit in maintaining it. Inscriptions found near the Eurotas River mention tribute offerings of grain and fabric made by helot women to Spartan temples. At first glance, they appear voluntary, but the quantities, exact to the weight of flesh, reveal otherwise. Each unit of tribute matched the estimated output of a woman's labor for one season. In other words, the gods were receiving their portion of the slave's exhaustion. There are hints, too, of quiet rebellion. Fragments of broken amphorae, buried deliberately, carved with faint lines of poetry. I sew the cloth of war, but not its pride. My hands feed my master, my bones remember my name. Archaeologists debate whether these were coded acts of resistance or personal lament. But the fact that they exist at all, buried in secret under the same soil that grew Spartan wheat, is proof that silence was never total. We find traces of women who refused to vanish. A handful of ancient Greek plays from outside Sparta reference the women of Ithome, former helots who sang forbidden songs at night, recalling their lost cities. Their lyrics spoke of freedom in metaphors. Birds that forget their wings still dream of flight. The Spartan authorities outlawed such songs. The penalty was flogging or disappearance. But still, the singing continued, because when words are forbidden, melody becomes survival. In the 3rd century BCE, long after Sparta's power had waned, travelers described seeing groups of elderly women in Laconia wearing plain tunics and holding rough clay idols, goddesses with broken arms. Local guides said they were descendants of helots, performing old rituals to honor the nameless mothers. Those broken idols were more than relics. They were memory made tangible. Fragments of a history Sparta tried to erase, yet could never silence completely. Historians often write that Sparta collapsed because its population fell, its economy stagnated, its walls never built high enough. But that's only half true. Sparta fell because it lost its women's silence. Once the system no longer had victims to feed it, no hands to weave, no wombs to replace its soldiers, it imploded. The same empire that had turned motherhood into machinery was undone when that machinery broke. In the end, these forgotten women outlasted the empire that consumed them. Their pain became sediment. Their stories became whispers in the earth. But they remain. Because power can erase a name, but never its consequences. And if history has ghosts, Sparta's ghosts wear the faces of the women who built its walls with their endurance and brought them down with their absence. Sparta no longer stands, but its question still does. How far can a society go in the pursuit of order before it destroys itself? For centuries, historians, generals, and empires have looked to Sparta for inspiration, seeing in its rigid system the blueprint of strength. But strength without humanity isn't stability, it's corrosion. Sparta's greatness didn't collapse in a single battle or a foreign invasion. It decayed from within, eaten alive by the very virtues it worshipped: discipline, obedience, control. The city that demanded silence from its slaves eventually demanded it from its own citizens. And when silence was all that remained, there was nothing left to defend. The bones tell a different story. Archaeologists studying Spartan burial grounds discovered something chilling. The skeletons of elite warriors show signs of chronic malnutrition and stress. Even the masters were starving under their own system. A society built on fear had made everyone, rulers and ruled alike, into prisoners. The helots, whose blood nourished the Spartan machine, carried no monuments. But in the soil of Laconia, fragments of their homes, children's toys, and charms made from river stones still appear. They whisper a truth older than conquest, that no structure of power can survive when it forgets the humanity it was built on. What Sparta called order was really paralysis, a civilization so afraid of weakness that it made compassion illegal. Its people worshipped endurance, but forgot joy. They sought immortality through obedience and achieved only extinction through imitation. In the long timeline of human civilization, Sparta shines for an instant and vanishes. Its philosophy of perfection left nothing behind that could grow. Where Athens left art, drama, philosophy, Sparta left procedure, and procedure doesn't outlive the hands that enforce it. But the question of Sparta never really ended. It haunts every empire that confuses control for peace. Rome learned it when its legions turned inward. Prussia learned it when discipline outpaced empathy. The 20th century learned it in camps, uniforms, and quotas that turned human beings into numbers, just as Sparta once did. And today, perhaps, we are still learning it in the quiet, efficient systems that promise safety in exchange for freedom. Every surveillance state, every algorithm that decides what we see and say, every law written in the name of stability, they all carry Sparta's ghost. Because Sparta wasn't just a city, it was an idea that fear can be the foundation of peace and control the guarantee of survival. And it worked, for a time, until the silence it demanded became too heavy for even the obedient to bear. In the end, when the Roman travelers walked among its ruins, they wrote that Sparta had no walls, for its men were its defense. They were wrong. The walls had always been there, invisible, internal, made of fear and obedience. And when those walls cracked, nothing remained but dust. The last lesson of Sparta is not about glory or strength, but about blindness. The blindness of any civilization that worships order without conscience. Sparta teaches that power, when stripped of empathy, becomes a self-devouring god, one that demands silence until even the gods fall quiet. The soil of Laconia still holds traces of that silence. If you walk its hills today, you can still find broken amphorae, ash from burned temples, and graves that never bore names. They belong not just to Spartans, but to the forgotten, the conquered, the used, the silenced. And maybe that is where the story should end. Not with the warriors who conquered, but with those who endured. Because when the legends fade, when marble turns to dust, when even the laws are lost, what remains is the question that outlives every empire. Who paid for your glory? If you value truth over legend, remember them, because history's bones still speak, completed.